There is a moment, somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning, when the room is still completely dark and your body is already awake. Not groggy. Not half asleep. Awake, in the particular way that feels final, like a door that has quietly clicked shut behind you. The ceiling comes into focus. The house is so still you can almost hear it. The street outside carries no sound yet. Even the birds are still deciding. You lie there and you feel the weight of the quiet, this particular quiet that belongs only to those hours, a silence that feels different from ordinary nighttime silence. Thicker somehow. More deliberate. And somewhere underneath the stillness, there is a thought you've had before, one that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles in anyway. That this keeps happening. That it's happening more. That somewhere between the person you were at 40 and the person lying here now, something changed, and you're not entirely sure what it means. You reach for the clock. For 47, and the thought arrives the way it always does, too early. Again. Most people assume that waking earlier as the decades pass is a symptom of something going wrong. A body losing its grip on rest. A system gradually winding down, unable to hold sleep the way it once did. That feels like a reasonable explanation, and it is also almost entirely wrong. What is actually happening is far more extraordinary than that. The shift you are experiencing is not the quiet failure of a clock that is losing time. It is the deliberate recalibration of one of the most sophisticated biological systems in the human body. And the science of what your brain is doing, in those hours before the world wakes up, is something most people over 60 have never been told. Welcome back to the Aging Mind. Subscribe before you leave, because what you are about to learn connects directly to your cognitive resilience, your emotional steadiness, and a kind of mental clarity that most people don't develop until exactly this stage of life. Today we are going through 8 things happening inside your brain when you wake early, and why each one tells a different part of the same remarkable story. Stay until the end, because the final section is the one that changes how you understand those pre-dawn hours entirely. It is the one that most people over 60 have lived through every morning of their lives and have never once been given a name for. Number 1. The clock that never stays still. You have, inside the base of your brain, a structure roughly the size of a grain of rice. It sits in a region called the hypothalamus, and it has been governing nearly every rhythm of your body since the day you were born. It controls when you feel alert and when you feel tired, when your body temperature rises and when it falls, when hormones surge and when they quiet. It does this with extraordinary precision, cycling through the same sequence day after day, coordinating the biological orchestra of being alive. Most people assume this structure simply ages the way everything else does, that it slows down, loses accuracy, gradually becomes less reliable. That when their sleep starts shifting earlier, it is this clock beginning to fail. That is not what is happening. Researchers at the University of Surrey Sleep Research Centre, studying how sleep timing changes across the lifespan, found something that surprised even the scientists involved. The shift toward earlier sleep and earlier waking in people over 60 is not a sign that the circadian clock is malfunctioning. It is a normative developmental transition, a scheduled reorganization built into the biology of aging. The clock isn't losing time. It is resetting to a different, and in many ways more efficient, rhythm. What clinicians once called advanced sleep phase syndrome turned out, on closer examination, to look far less like a disorder and far more like a deliberate design choice. Your brain did not forget how to keep time. It chose different hours. But what changes from within that clock, and why? That is where things become genuinely remarkable. Number 2. The light your brain has stopped trusting. Deep inside that master clock sits a small cluster of neurons that speaks directly to your eyes, not through conscious vision, but through a separate pathway entirely, one that evolved solely to detect the presence or absence of light. This pathway feeds information directly to the clock, helping it anchor itself to the rhythms of the natural world. Most people assume the eye simply transmits the same information throughout life. That light is light. That is not what is happening. Scientists at Harvard Medical School's Division of Sleep Medicine discovered that the sensitivity of this pathway changes meaningfully in older adults. The master clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, becomes more responsive to morning light cues after 60. Not less responsive. More. The brain begins treating the first pale signal of dawn as a stronger anchor point than it did decades earlier. It pulls sleep earlier to align itself with that recalibrated cue. The early waking is, in this sense, the brain doing its job with unusual precision, locking itself to the light with a grip that is tighter, not looser, than it once was. Your brain has not stopped reading the light. It has started reading it more carefully. What this means for you is specific. The early waking is a calibration event, not a disruption. The brain is pulling itself into alignment with something real and external, the actual rhythm of light on this planet, with more attentiveness than it brought to this task at 35. But the light is only one part of the recalibration. What happens to the architecture of sleep itself, to its internal structure, is where the story becomes even more personal. Number 3. What happens to the architecture of a night? A full night of sleep is not a single unbroken state. It is a series of distinct stages cycling through the night in a specific sequence: light sleep, deep restorative sleep, and REM sleep, each doing different work, each arriving at different points. The sequence is not random. It is choreographed. And that choreography shifts considerably across a lifetime. Most people assume that waking at 4 a.m. means the night was interrupted, that something was missed, that the final hours of sleep were simply lost. That is not what is happening. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry, conducting longitudinal studies of sleep architecture in adults over 60, found that the most restorative stages of sleep, the deep slow-wave sleep that governs physical repair and memory consolidation, arrive earlier in the night in older adults than they do in younger ones. They arrive earlier, and they are complete earlier. By 4 a.m. in many people over 60, the night's most critical biological work is already done. The sleep has not been cut short. It has been redistributed. The stages that matter most have already run their course. What feels like waking before sleep is finished may in fact be waking after sleep has done its essential work, and what remains is simply the quiet. What this means for you is not a small thing. It means the body's primary repair cycle may already be complete when your eyes open in the dark. You were not robbed of sleep. You finished it. Number 4. The hormone that is actually working. In the hours before dawn, a hormone begins its daily rise, moving steadily upward from its lowest point of the night toward the first peak of morning. This hormone is cortisol. Most people have heard its name primarily in the context of stress, the body's emergency chemical, the thing that surges when something is wrong. And so when the body feels alert at 4 a.m., with that particular sharpened quality of early waking, the assumption follows almost automatically. Most people assume this alertness is anxiety, that the early waking is tinged with urgency, with a low hum of unease that belongs to cortisol and to stress. That is not what is happening. Scientists at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, researching cortisol and circadian activation patterns in aging populations, found that in older adults, the cortisol awakening response, the natural morning surge of this hormone, arrives earlier and more sharply than it does in younger adults. But this earlier, sharper rise is not a sign of elevated stress. It is the brain's preferred ignition sequence. Cortisol in this context is not an alarm signal. It is a starting pistol, the biological mechanism by which the brain shifts from sleep consciousness to waking consciousness with clarity and intention. The sharpness you feel at 4:47 in the morning is not your nervous system misfiring. It is your brain completing its startup sequence exactly as designed, and completing it well. What this means for you is something worth sitting with for a moment. The alertness is not a symptom. It is the product of a system working precisely as it should. But the question that follows is the more interesting one. What is the brain, now alert, now active, actually doing with those quiet hours? Number 5. The quiet rewiring no one told you about. The hours between 4 and 6 in the morning are, for most people over 60, hours that simply happen, endured, sometimes, or inhabited quietly while the rest of the world still sleeps. They are not usually thought of as hours in which something specific and important is occurring at a neurological level. Most people assume that lying awake in the early hours is time that is neither sleep nor real waking, a kind of biological no man's land, doing nothing much in either direction. That is not what is happening. Researchers at UC Berkeley Center for Human Sleep Science, studying the relationship between sleep and memory in aging adults, found that the pre-dawn window is a period of heightened neural consolidation activity. During this phase, when the brain hovers in the light and shifting territory between deep sleep and full wakefulness, sleep spindles are still active. These are brief, rhythmic bursts of neural activity that function as one of the brain's primary mechanisms for sorting and filing memory. Emotional memories from the previous days are being processed and recontextualized. Experiences are being categorized. The brain is, in this window, not idle. It is performing a kind of maintenance operation, organizing the previous day's experience, smoothing its emotional edges, filing what matters and releasing what does not. The early morning quiet is not dead time between sleep and waking. It is the brain completing its archival work. What this means for you is that the thoughts that arrive in those hours, the memories, the reconsiderations, the sudden clarity about something that felt clouded the day before, are not random. They are the output of an active process. The brain is handing you what it has finished working on. Number 6. Why your thinking feels different in the morning. There is something that many people over 60 notice and rarely mention, a particular quality of thinking that arrives in the early morning hours, before the day fills in, before the obligations begin. A clarity that feels almost architectural. A capacity for holding complex thoughts, seeing them whole, finding the thread that connects things that seem disconnected the night before. Most people assume this is simply the result of having slept, that rest produces clarity, and morning clarity is nothing more than the absence of fatigue. That is not what is happening. Researchers at Duke University's Center for Aging, studying diurnal cognitive performance across age groups, found a striking difference between younger and older adults in when the prefrontal cortex, the brain's center for reasoning, judgment, and complex analysis, reaches its peak daily activation. In younger adults, this peak arrives later in the day. In people over 60, it arrives in the early morning. The most sophisticated part of the brain, the part responsible for the highest forms of human thinking, is operating at full capacity in the exact window when younger adults are still in cognitive fog. The early morning is not merely pleasant for people in their 60s. It is neurologically optimal. The sharpest hours of the day arrive first, before anything has touched them. What this means for you is that the morning clarity you experience is not accidental. It is the product of a brain that has shifted its peak performance window forward in time, handing you your best thinking at the beginning of the day, before the day has asked anything of you yet. Number 7. The connection to emotional steadiness. There is a structure deep in the brain, the amygdala, that functions as the brain's threat detection system. It scans the environment, assesses risk, and generates the emotional responses that accompany fear, anxiety, and urgency. In younger adults, it is particularly active during periods of uncertainty, and particularly sensitive to emotional stimuli. In older adults, something significant shifts. Most people assume that emotional steadiness later in life, that relative calm, that capacity for not being rattled by things that once rattled, is simply the product of experience. That having seen enough, survived enough, a person simply stops reacting as sharply. That is far more nuanced than that. Scientists at Stanford Center on Longevity, studying amygdala reactivity across age groups, found that in older adults, particularly during the early waking hours, amygdala activity is measurably reduced. The brain's alarm system becomes quieter during precisely the window when the body is most alert. This is not emotional blunting. It is a documented shift in the relationship between the thinking brain and the reacting brain. The prefrontal cortex, operating at peak capacity in the early morning, exerts stronger regulatory influence over the amygdala during these hours. The result is a quality of awareness that is sharp but not agitated, alert but not anxious. The calm that many people over 60 describe in the early morning, that particular quality of clear, unfrightened waking, is not imagined. It is neurologically real. What this means for you is that those early hours are not just cognitively optimal. They are emotionally optimal. The brain, in those hours, is running the most balanced version of itself. Number 8. What the early hours are actually for. Here is something that has been lost in the way modern life frames sleep, and it changes everything about what it means to wake in the early morning. Most people assume that consolidated 8 hours of unbroken sleep, from darkness until alarm, is the natural human sleep pattern, the original template, the baseline against which everything else is measured as a deviation. That assumption has been examined carefully. Historian A. Roger E. Kirch at Virginia Tech spent decades researching sleep patterns in pre-industrial cultures, combing through diaries, court records, medical texts, and literature from across centuries and continents. What he found was something that had been hiding in plain sight. Before the age of artificial light, the dominant human sleep pattern was not 8 unbroken hours. It was 2 separate periods of sleep, what he called segmented or biphasic sleep, with a quiet waking interval of 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night. This interval was documented across cultures and centuries as a natural, expected part of the night. People used it to pray, to think, to talk quietly with those beside them, to tend to tasks, to simply be awake in the particular way the dark hours allow. The first recorded descriptions of insomnia, in historical texts more than 500 years old, do not describe the inability to sleep through the night. They describe the inability to return to sleep after the waking interval. The middle of the night waking was not the problem. It was the pattern. What we now call early waking is, in all probability, one of the oldest rhythms in human biology, more ancient than alarm clocks, more ancient than electricity, more ancient than the idea that a single unbroken night is what the body is supposed to do. What this means for you is not small. You are not experiencing a failure of modern sleep. You may be experiencing the most human, the most ancient, the most original sleep pattern there is. Your brain is doing something it has always known how to do. You are the one who was told it was wrong. And now, the thing most people carry into those hours alone. There is something about 4 in the morning that no one quite prepares you for. Not the neuroscience of it. Not the history of it. Something older and quieter than either of those things. It is the particular texture of being awake when no one else is. The way the dark sits differently at that hour, not the dark of midnight, which still feels like the middle of something, but the dark of nearly dawn, which feels like the edge of something. Like standing at the threshold of a day that hasn't committed to arriving yet. In those hours, thoughts come that don't come at other times. Not anxious thoughts, necessarily, though sometimes those too. But the deeper ones. The ones that live underneath the noise of ordinary days. You think about people you've lost. You think about the years behind you, not with regret exactly, but with a kind of quiet taking stock that daylight is too busy to allow. You think about whether you said what needed saying. Whether you did enough of what mattered. Whether the people who mattered knew. These are not the thoughts of a declining mind. These are the thoughts of a mind that has finally earned the right to ask the real questions. A mind that has lived long enough to know which questions are the real ones, and wise enough to save them for the hours when honesty is possible. The brain, in the early morning, is at its most balanced, its most clear, its most emotionally available. And it is delivering you to the hardest, most important thoughts you carry. Not to torment you. Because it trusts you with them. Because you have spent a lifetime building the capacity to hold them without flinching. Those hours are not lost hours. They are not broken hours. They are not the product of a body that has forgotten how to rest. They are yours. Entirely, quietly, irreplaceably yours. The one part of the day that belongs to no one else, answers to nothing, and gives back whatever it is you bring to the silence. The brain doesn't wake you early because something is wrong. It wakes you early because something is ready. Tell me in the comments, what do you do in those early hours, the ones before the world wakes up? Whether you lie quietly, make tea, sit by a window, or just let your mind go where it wants, I'd love to know, because I think those hours hold more than most people give them credit for. I read every one. I will see you in the next one.